The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the Texas borderlands. For months, it had offered no respite, baking the soil into a mosaic of fissures that stretched to a hazy, heat-distorted horizon. Jedediah Stone rode slowly, the leather of his saddle creaking in rhythm with his horse's weary steps. His face, weathered as an old boot, was a mask of grim resolve. The drought had taken everything: his sparse crops, most of his cattle, and the last embers of hope from his neighbors. All he had left was this small, isolated ranch and a stubbornness forged in hardship. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, scanned the desolate landscape. It was then he saw it, a small, dark shape huddled against the rust-colored rock of a dry creek bed. Not a coyote or a fallen calf. It was too small, too still. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He nudged his horse, closing the distance with a caution that had become second nature in this unforgiving land. Dismounting, the dust puffing up around his worn boots, he realized it was a child. A native child, Apache by the small beaded accents on the worn tunic, no older than 5 or 6. They were unconscious, their small chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Their lips were split and pale, their skin covered in a fine layer of dust. They were dying of heat and thirst. Jedediah's heart, a thing he usually kept well guarded, lurched. He looked around. No tracks, no sign of family, just the oppressive silence of the heat. He unslung his canteen, hearing the pathetic slosh of the last few swallows of water. In his saddlebag, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a single, hard biscuit, his supper for the night, and likely his breakfast too. It was all he had. He looked from the meager provisions to the child's face. There wasn't a choice to be made, not for a man like him. Kneeling, he uncorked the canteen and let a few precious drops of water fall onto the child's lips. Then he broke the bread, softened a small piece with water, and gently pushed it past their cracked lips. The first light of dawn crept over the jagged peaks, painting the dusty landscape in soft hues of gray and lavender. A profound chill hung in the air, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the previous day. Jedediah stirred from a shallow, restless sleep, the floorboards of his small cabin groaning under his weight. His first conscious thought was of the child. He moved with a practiced quietness to the corner where he'd laid them on a makeshift bed of his softest blankets. The child's breathing was shallow but steady, a fragile rhythm that offered a sliver of hope. A faint warmth radiated from their small body, a sign of life holding on. A measure of relief washed over him. They had made it through the night. Jedediah felt a familiar, rasping thirst claw at his own throat. He crossed the single room to the window, his gaze habitually sweeping over his parched land as he reached for his nearly empty canteen. He intended to take a careful sip, conserving the precious liquid. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim morning light, he froze. His hand, holding the canteen, stopped midway to his mouth. The metal felt ice-cold against his skin. It wasn't the familiar, empty expanse of his ranch he saw. It was them. Silently, as if they had sprung from the dry earth itself during the night, hundreds of Apache warriors formed a wide, unbroken circle around his homestead. There was no charge, no war cry, only a terrifying, disciplined stillness. They stood and sat upon their horses, their figures stark and imposing against the burgeoning sunrise. Feathers in their hair stirred in the faint breeze, and the cold glint of rifle barrels and the sharp points of lances caught the first rays of light. Their faces were impassive, masks of stone and shadow, their dark eyes fixed unerringly on his cabin. The silence was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that was more terrifying than any battle cry. Every escape route was cut off. Every window, every angle offered the same view, a stoic warrior staring back. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the deafening stillness. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He wasn't just seen, he was being judged. His solitary act of mercy had not gone unnoticed. It had brought an army to his door. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the oppressive silence. Each beat of Jedediah's heart was a drum against his ribs, a frantic rhythm only he could hear. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to point like accusatory fingers from the warriors to his small, vulnerable cabin. Sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes. Then, a subtle shift. The sea of stoic figures parted as one man began to walk forward. He was taller than the others, his face a mask of stern authority, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and command. He wore a simple leather vest, but his presence was more imposing than any uniform. He wasn't rushing. Each step was deliberate, measured, closing the distance to the porch with unnerving calm. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed, a man who held life and death in his gaze. Jedediah's hand instinctively twitched towards the Winchester rifle leaning just inside the door, but he stifled the impulse. One move, one mistake, and this dusty patch of earth would be his grave. He had to show he was not a threat. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his empty hands to shoulder height, palms facing forward in a universal gesture of peace. The leader stopped just short of the wooden steps, his dark eyes boring into Jedediah's, searching for deceit, for malice. He spoke, and the sound was a low, guttural rumble, a language Jedediah didn't understand but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. It was an accusation, a demand. Jedediah swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He couldn't speak their tongue, so he had to use the only language they might both understand. He lowered one hand slowly, pointed to his own mouth, and mimed drinking. Then he pointed to the nearly empty water barrel by the door. He touched his stomach and mimed eating, then gestured to the empty bread sack hanging from a nail. Finally, with a heart hammering against his chest, he pointed a trembling finger towards the closed cabin door. As the leader's eyes narrowed, a new sound cut through the tension, a faint, weak cough from inside the cabin. It was small, fragile, but in the charged silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The leader's stony expression flickered. For the first time, a sliver of something other than cold authority appeared in his eyes, the unmistakable glint of a father's fear. The sound, fragile as a dry leaf, hung in the charged air between them. The Apache leader's eyes, once hard as flint, flickered. His gaze shot from Jedediah to the cabin door, a silent, unequivocal demand. He pointed a single, steady finger toward the entrance. There was no room for negotiation. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to bar the door, to protect the small life inside and his own. But he saw the raw anguish that had broken through the warrior's mask. This was not a chief threatening an enemy. This was a father desperate to reach his child. With a slow, deliberate exhale, Jedediah gave a single, sharp nod. He lowered his hands and stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. The leader moved past him without a second glance, his moccasins silent on the wooden floorboards. The sudden shift from the blinding sun to the dim interior made him pause for a moment, his silhouette framed against the harsh light. His eyes adjusted, landing on the small form lying on the cot. He moved to the bedside, his large frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He knelt, his movements fluid and noiseless. He reached out a hand, not with the force of a warrior, but with the trembling gentleness of a parent, and brushed the matted hair from the child's forehead. The child's eyelids fluttered open. A weak, raspy sound escaped their lips, a name that sounded like Ta. The leader's shoulders slumped with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. He murmured something soft and low in his native tongue. The child, gathering a flicker of strength, lifted a weak hand and pointed, not at Jedediah, but at the empty canteen hanging from a peg on the wall, and then to the few remaining crumbs on the small wooden plate beside the cot. Their gaze then moved to Jedediah, who stood frozen by the door. The message was clear. The leader's eyes followed the child's gesture. He looked at the evidence of care, then back at the white man. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a complex, unreadable expression, a dawning understanding, perhaps even a flicker of gratitude. He rose, turned to face Jedediah, and for the first time, the threat had vanished from his posture. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken emotions. The Apache leader, Taza, knelt beside the cot, one large, calloused hand gently resting on his child's forehead. He looked at Jedediah, his dark eyes no longer holding suspicion, but a deep, weary gratitude. He then rose and went to the cabin door, opening it just enough to speak a few sharp, guttural words to the men outside. A moment later, an older man with deep lines etched into his face and silver-streaked hair entered, carrying a worn leather pouch. He was the tribe's medicine man, Nakai. Nakai moved with a quiet authority, his gaze fixed solely on the child. He paid Jedediah no mind, as if the cowboy were merely part of the room's furniture. From his pouch, he produced dried herbs, which he began to grind in a small stone bowl. He mixed the powder with a bit of water from one of the Apache canteens, creating a dark, earthy-smelling paste. He gently applied the poultice to the child's chest. Then, he began brewing a tea over Jedediah's small stove, the bitter aroma filling the confined space. Jedediah watched from his corner, feeling like an intruder in this sacred, private ritual. He glanced out the window. The tension that had held the morning in a vice grip was finally breaking. Warriors were dismounting, their rigid postures softening. They moved with purpose, tending to their horses or gathering in small, quiet groups. The immediate threat had passed, replaced by a patient, collective vigil. When the tea was ready, Taza carefully lifted his child's head, and Nakai administered the dark liquid, spoonful by spoonful. The child drank weakly before falling into a deeper, more restful sleep. Taza looked at Jedediah, then reached into his own satchel and pulled out a strip of dried venison. He held it out. Jedediah hesitated for only a second before accepting it. It was not just food. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge built across a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. In the silence of the cabin, a fragile peace had been forged. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on the parched earth with relentless intensity. Inside the cabin, the low hum of Nakai's chants was a constant, steady rhythm beneath the oppressive silence. The child's breathing was more regular, a small victory in the vast, thirsty landscape. Outside, Jedediah and Taza stood not as adversaries, but as two men watching the same ruthless sky, united by a shared, unspoken anxiety. The piece of dried meat Taza had shared was gone, but the gesture's weight remained. Breaking the quiet, Taza pointed a weathered finger towards the horizon, where his people's temporary camp was hidden among the heat-shimmering rocks. He then touched his lips, cracked and dry, and made a universal gesture for drinking, finishing with a slow, despairing shake of his head. His expression was grim. "Water gone," he said, the English words rough but clear. He swept his arm across the vast expanse, indicating his tribe, his family. The desperation that had fueled his frantic search for his child was now refocused on the survival of his entire people. Jedediah's own throat was a desert. His well, a shallow pit dug with backbreaking labor, was nearly dry, yielding only muddy dregs. He looked at Taza, at the stoic warriors who watched their leader, their faces etched with the same silent suffering. They would all perish here. Then, a memory surfaced, a story his grandfather used to tell on cold winter nights of a hidden spring high in the treacherous Black Mesa, a place settlers avoided, believing it cursed. The Apache, he knew, held it as sacred and forbidden ground. Making a decision that felt both insane and necessary, Jedediah knelt. He picked up a stick and began scratching in the dust. He drew the outline of his ranch, then a long, winding path leading to a crude drawing of the flat-topped mesas looming in the distance. He looked up at Taza, pointed to the drawing of the mountain, and then mimed climbing and drinking deep. "Water," he said, his voice raspy. "High up. Hard trail, dangerous." Taza stared at the map in the dust, his dark eyes tracing the path. He knew the place Jedediah indicated, the Spirit Mesa. His people avoided it, but desperation was a powerful force that could bend even the oldest traditions. He looked from the crude map to Jedediah's earnest face, then to the silent, waiting warriors. This white man who had saved his son was now offering their only chance. With a solemn, determined nod, Taza accepted. The truce had been forged in compassion. The alliance was now sealed by necessity. The journey to Black Mesa was a silent testament to their shared desperation. Jedediah led the way, his worn boots kicking up dust that swirled in the oppressive heat. Behind him, Taza guided his people, a long, weary procession against the stark, cracked earth. There were no words exchanged, only the grim language of survival. A pointed finger from Jedediah indicating a treacherous patch of loose rock. A quiet hand signal from Taza to halt the column as the weak rested. The sun beat down mercilessly, but for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope that burned brighter than the heat. After 2 days of grueling travel, they reached the foothills of the mesa. The air grew cooler as they ascended a narrow, hidden canyon Jedediah had known since he was a boy. The towering rock walls offered shade, a blessed relief. Then, a new sound reached them, not the whisper of the dry wind, but the faint, unmistakable trickle of water. A murmur of awe rippled through the Apache. At the end of the canyon lay a small grotto, where clear, cold water seeped from the dark rock, gathering in a deep pool fringed with green moss and ferns. It was life itself. Children rushed forward, their tired faces breaking into joyous smiles as they splashed their hands in the cool water. The warriors drank deeply, their stoic expressions softening with profound relief. Taza's son, leaning against his father, looked at Jedediah with eyes full of a child's simple, powerful gratitude. Taza approached Jedediah, not as a chief to an outsider, but as one man to another. He placed a hand on Jedediah's shoulder, a gesture of deep respect that transcended language. In the shade of Black Mesa, by the life-giving spring, their alliance was sealed, not by words, but by the shared victory over the unforgiving land, forging a lasting peace born from a single act of compassion.